Instantly establishing central presence, d4 claims valuable space and opens diagonal lines for the queen and bishop. Developing the knight to a central square prepares for rapid pawn expansion and potential kingside aggression. Asserting central control, c4 immediately challenges black's knight and aims for a queenside pawn majority. Opens the diagonal for the queen's bishop and solidifies the center, preparing for a more active development. Developing the knight here efficiently prepares for kingside castling and exerts pressure on black's central setup. Challenging the center immediately, this thrust aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for piece activity. Opening the center aggressively, white aims to exploit the unleashed diagonals and potential pawn weaknesses. Reclaiming the central pawn immediately reestablishes black's pawn presence and opens lines for piece development. Developing the knight here prepares castling and helps control the central squares, aiming for harmonious piece deployment. Asserting central presence, this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's space and initiates a dynamic pawn structure fight. Securing the center and preparing for bishop development, this move aims to consolidate white's pawn structure and unblock the f1 bishop, opening avenues for kingside activity and potentially preparing a timely queenside expansion. Developing a knight to its most natural square here reestablishes central influence and prepares for castling, a crucial step for king's safety, while also eyeing the d4 pawn. Developing the bishop to this diagonal opens up attacking possibilities and prepares to castle, aiming to solidify white's central influence while eyeing black's kingside. Developing the bishop to e7 shores up the kingside and prepares for castling, a crucial step in consolidating the central pawn structure against white's immediate pressure. Securing the monarch is paramount. This castle initiates a crucial phase of king's safety and prepares the rooks for potential central control or flank pressure, a wise precaution before committing further forces in this dynamic Catalan structure. Securing the monarch amidst the central storm initiates the crucial development phase, preparing for the inevitable pawn skirmishes and potential piece migrations. Proactively securing the queenside, white intends to restrict black's queenside expansion, specifically eyeing the b4 square, and simultaneously prepares a potential queenside pawn push later to gain space. This move is a subtle yet effective maneuver, aiming to build a solid pawn structure and limit black's active counterplay on the flank, while also creating a safe haven for the knight if it needs to retreat. Sacrificing a pawn temporarily for better piece activity, and a more open center is the essence of this capture, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain dynamic counterplay. Reclaiming the central pawn opens up white's queen and bishop, activating them for the middle game struggle and preparing to contest the d-file. This maintains material equality while creating subtle pressure on black's queenside pawns. The knight's return to f6 elegantly prepares for a potential central pawn push with e5, simultaneously reinforcing the d5 square and offering a tactical avenue to disrupt white's pawn structure should they commit their own pawns further. This subtle repositioning underscores a commitment to active piece play over static pawn formations, hinting at a desire to seize the initiative by challenging white's central dominance. It's a move that prioritizes flexibility and potential counterplay. Shifting the bishop to c2 aims to improve its defensive coverage of the queenside and prepare for potential pawn pushes like b4, while also creating a retreat square if needed. Unfurling the queenside pawn structure, black seeks to gain influence on the queenside and potentially prepare for a future bb7 to challenge white's central control, though this does slightly concede space and opens a path for white's pieces to potentially exert pressure on that wing if not handled carefully. Unifying the queen with the rook's potential on the d-file heralds a proactive stance, preparing to exploit any imbalances that may arise in the center. Finally, the dark-squared bishop finds its active post, aiming its gaze towards white's queenside castled king, a potential launchpad for future pawn storms or tactical incursions down the semi-open c-file. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal, white aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure by targeting the knight on f6, a critical defender of the d5 square and indirectly the kingside. This pressure could lead to opportunities for white's pieces to penetrate if black isn't careful with their defense. Preparing to expand on the kingside, g6 aims to support a subsequent fianchetto of the bishop, creating a robust defensive barrier around the black monarch and potentially initiating counterplay on the queenside. Pivoting the rook to the central file signals an aggressive intent to contest open lines and potentially pressure black's king, a proactive approach that eschews passive development. Initiating a fluid defense of the central pawn chain, this move artfully prepares to contest the open e-file while simultaneously reinforcing the f6 knight's security. It's a nuanced positional maneuver that aims to neutralize white's encroaching bishop on g5 and avoid the potential structural weaknesses that a passive setup might invite, instead opting for a more robust and coordinated defensive posture. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, 15. h4 signals white's intention to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially open lines towards the king. This aggressive pawn push generates immediate spatial pressure, aiming to cramp black's pieces and limit their mobility, particularly on the kingside where the g6 pawn now becomes a potential target. The move also serves to create a shield for white's own king, should exchanges occur, while simultaneously preparing for future attacking thrusts. Black must carefully consider how to counter this territorial encroachment and prevent the pawn advance from becoming a decisive weapon. Asserting control over the open, c-file with the rook represents a decisive shift in priorities, aiming to challenge white's central influence and prepare for a potential kingside expansion or piece redeployment. Bolstering the queen's rook to the c-file solidifies white's presence on the open file, aiming to outmaneuver black's pieces for crucial control and potential breakthroughs against the queenside pawns. The knight now eyes the c3 square, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially fork the queen and rook should the opportunity arise on an opportune moment. A classic maneuver in these closed positions where piece activity is paramount. Venturing the knight to e4, white aims to exploit potential weaknesses around black's kingside, particularly the f6 square, while simultaneously preparing for a possible pawn storm with f4. This maneuver seeks to create dynamic imbalances, potentially forcing black into uncomfortable defensive postures and opening lines for white's pieces toward the enemy monarch. Black bravely challenges the center and white's knight outpost with a pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces and open lines for counterplay. This aggressive pawn push, while creating immediate tension, also demands careful calculation to avoid positional weaknesses, particularly around black's king if the central fight escalates unexpectedly. Liberating the knight from its passive guarding role on f3, white aims to re-energize the kingside and prepare for potential pawn storms, while also anticipating black's threatened pawn advance. Finally, black breaks open the complex central pawn structure, initiating a sequence that directly addresses white's knight on e4 and introduces the concept of the bishop pair as a potential long-term advantage, though this exchange also clears the way for white's pieces to potentially occupy the now-open g-file. By clearing the knight from the f3 square, white opens a direct line for the rook on e1 and, importantly, clears the path for the king's knight to potentially redeploy to a more aggressive square, perhaps f4 or g5 itself, creating immediate pressure on black's weakened kingside. This repositioning hints at a desire to exploit the d5 outpost black has established, now that their own g6 pawn has created a slight structural weakness around the black monarch. Unleashing a knight's powerful spearhead, f4 ignites a sharp tactical confrontation, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create immediate attacking possibilities against the weakened kingside. Activating the queen on e3 pivots white's focus towards the kingside initiative, potentially eyeing the weakened f6 square and the black king, while simultaneously offering a trade of queens if black wishes to simplify and relieve pressure. Black boldly seizes the initiative, immediately challenging white's central pawn and forcing a reckoning in the queen trade, a decision that will profoundly alter the game's complexion and likely lead to an immediate simplification of the board, potentially opening lines that were previously well defended. This aggressive knight sortie to the queenside immediately puts pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially creates attacking chances on the c7 pawn. Suddenly, the queen exchange simplifies the position, offering black a breathing room after a period of intense pressure on the queen side. This maneuver skillfully sidesteps further complications and prepares for a potentially more manageable middle game, shifting the focus to piece activity and central control. Reclaiming central space and solidifying the pawn structure becomes paramount as white captures the knight, initiating a potential structural shift in the center. The knights clash and a tactical storm brews as black boldly snatches a pawn, hoping to disrupt white's newly acquired central space and create attacking chances on the king side. Relinquishing the central king's safety, this recapture opens the g-file directly to the monarch, creating immediate, albeit currently contained, threats. That timely knight check jolts the game into a new dynamic, forcing the white king into a precarious central position and opening up avenues for increased pressure. The immediate aftermath of the exchange at g2 has left white's monarch exposed, and this knight's sortie exploits that weakness with a tempo. Now, black can look to solidify their piece activity and begin exploiting the compromised kingside. The bishop now boldly occupies the central highway, a crucial outpost dictating the flow of the ensuing positional struggle. The knight's sacrifice opens a crucial diagonal for the bishop, forcing a pawn exchange that dramatically simplifies the material balance and significantly impacts the king's safety, as white's monarch now faces increased pressure on the g-file. The exchange of knights and queens has undeniably simplified the position, but white's recapturing knight now finds itself in a somewhat awkward central position, potentially becoming a target for black's active pieces. Seizing the open file with that knight gambit dramatically alters the endgame's character, forcing white to defend against imminent threats. Unleashing a potent check, white immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and forces a critical decision regarding the exposed monarch. The king's escape route, desperately sought, now leads directly into the storm created by the knight's advanced position. Recapturing the knight eliminates black's most active piece and opens the e-file for white's rook, promising future pressure. The rook's relocation to the open file immediately intensifies the pressure along the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially exploit the pinned knight on g2, though its immediate tactical impact is limited as white's king has evaded the immediate danger. Opening the queenside to pressure that isolated pawn and improve the knight's prospects is the immediate goal, aiming to exploit weaknesses on the file. Initiating a strategic retreat for the knight, this maneuver reclaims crucial central influence after the pawn exchange, seeking to prevent white's bishop from dominating the b2-g7 diagonal and preparing to contest the open c-file, a key battleground for the ensuing endgame. Forcefully wresting control of the 7th rank, this check aims to disrupt black's defensive structure and exploit the awkward placement of their knight. Recognizing the forced nature of the rook sacrifice, black's monarch bravely steps into the fray, attempting to secure relative safety behind the d6 knight while hoping to disrupt white's nascent queenside advantage and exploit the weakened kingside structure created by white's pawn advances. Aimed at securing the open c-file, this repositioning of the rook prepares for a decisive penetration into black's territory, potentially creating a passed pawn or forcing further concessions in the pawn structure. A passive defensive gesture, h6, relinquishes control of the g6 square, potentially creating a weak square there later, and does little to address white's imposing control of the open c-file, which now threatens to roll into black's position with devastating effect. Seizing the open file with the rook offers a tactical opportunity, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside, as the rook penetrates deeply into enemy territory, forcing a defensive reaction and complicating black's already precarious position. The knight's bold sortie to e4 immediately disrupts white's rook dominance on the 7th rank and aims to exploit the potential weakness of the advanced pawn. Pivoting the rook to attack the knight, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and force concessions, potentially opening lines for further penetration. Relocating the rook to this open file initiates a crucial race against white's pawn advances, aiming to disrupt their coordinated attack before the queenside structure crumbles under pressure. Reinforcing the central occupation with the rook now prepares for a potential exchange on the c-file, aiming to simplify into a more favorable rook and pawn endgame where white's passed a pawn could become a significant asset if black isn't careful. The bishop's removal from the queen side dramatically alters the fight for the center, as black marshals forces to penetrate the d-file and disrupt white's coordination. This aggressive rook lift not only attacks the isolated pawn on d3, but also aims to create a formidable battery along the 7th rank, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially corner the enemy monarch. Embracing the open file, black redirects their rook to the heart of white's weakened structure, a bold maneuver aiming to disrupt any lingering coordination and exploit the potential for central penetration. Seizing the open file with the rook on the 7th rank creates immediate pressure, forcing black to react defensively and potentially sacrificing material to alleviate the impending queenside dissection. Unleashing the pawn offers an immediate threat to the white rook, forcing a positional concession as the kingside pawns are now dangerously advanced and vulnerable. A bold decision to embrace the exposed king, inviting complications and relying on piece activity over pawn structure. Finally, a decisive action after prolonged maneuvering, this capture dramatically simplifies the material, leading to a starkly different endgame where the open files and pawn structure will be paramount for victory. White's monarch now finds a bit more breathing room after the exchange, though the pawn structure remains a bit porous on the kingside, demanding careful attention to prevent further inroads. Unlocking the central file, black's rook penetrates the enemy position, aiming to disrupt white's already compromised pawn structure and create new attacking avenues. Asserting queenside dominion initiates a crucial pawn advance, aiming to outflank the opponent's rook and potentially create a passed pawn deep into enemy territory. Pivoting the rook to the 3rd rank strategically bolsters black's pawn push, aiming to exploit the open b-file and create potential mating threats down the line if white's king remains exposed. Pondering the pawn's forward march, white initiates a decisive territorial grab, aiming to outflank the rook and isolate it on the queen side, transforming the board into a more favorable endgame scenario for the attacking king. Seizing the open file is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's pawn majority and create counterplay. The rook's aggressive doubling along the 3rd rank aims to exploit the newly opened file and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black attempts to shatter white's solid pawn structure and create chaos around the still uncastled monarch. Sacrificing the pawn opens a deadly diagonal for your rook, aiming to trap the black king as it scrambles for safety. The pawn chain breaks, opening a path for your king to escape the dangerous central files, but be wary of the immediate threats the unleashed rook and queen present. Pushing the b-pawn now aims to create an unstoppable passed pawn, forcing black's pieces to commit to its blockade and hopefully opening pathways for your remaining pieces to exert pressure. Unleashing the passed pawn with a determined stride, this advance prepares to pierce white's defenses, aiming to seize the crucial central squares and potentially create a decisive mating attack against a somewhat exposed monarch. This rook swing aims to disrupt the black pawn chain and potentially exploit the weakened kingside, creating threats on the 7th rank. Unleashing the king into the fray here is a gamble of epic proportions, potentially transforming a passive position into a dynamic battleground by exploiting the open files and the king's inherent mobility. The pawn advances, opening up the queen's rook to potentially harass the black king from the flank while simultaneously creating a passed pawn deep in enemy territory. Embracing a desperate final gambit, this pawn's bold advance creates immediate peril for the white monarch, forcing an awkward king repositioning and offering black a flicker of counterplay in a seemingly lost endgame. The monarch desperately seeks a sanctuary, finding none amidst the pawn storm's relentless advance. The king's desperate flight across the battlefield is interrupted by a final, piercing check, forcing the opponent's monarch into an exposed position. The monarch is exposed, so securing its safety by moving it away from the immediate attacking lines is paramount. The pawn's irresistible march to the 8th rank is now an immediate threat, forcing the king to step into an even more exposed position. The white king's desperate gamble for survival finds a glimmer of hope as it cuts off the black pawn's advance. Black's king, now an exposed target, must navigate a perilous path away from the relentless pressure of white's rook and the discovered check threat. Forcing the king into a checking predicament, this move initiates a swift endgame exchange, aiming to simplify the position and exploit the exposed monarch. The king, exposed and vulnerable after a desperate pawn push, faces imminent danger. The promotion threat now becomes paramount, forcing black's immediate attention away from any potential counterplay. Suddenly, a queen appears, creating a fresh whirlwind of possibilities as the pawns have finally paid their dues in the endgame skirmish. Promoting a queen here with checks forces an immediate response and begins the final sequence of eliminating black's offensive potential. The promotion race is on, and black's king is making a daring dash across the board, hoping to disrupt white's queen promotion and create counterplay. The reigning queen sacrifices herself to initiate a forced sequence, ensuring the black king can't escape the onslaught of perpetual checks and ultimately leading to a decisive material advantage. A desperate attempt to revive the game by attacking the newly promoted queen and hoping to snag it with the rook, though this appears to be a futile gesture given the superior position and material advantage. A final decisive checkmate looms as the queen boldly slices across the board, forcing a critical decision for the black king amidst the pawn storm. The black king, having ventured far from its protective pawns, now finds itself in a precarious position, a magnet for the white queen's aggressive pursuit. Initiating a decisive queen maneuver to shepherd the enemy king, forcing it into a more exposed position on the dark squares. Unleashing a cascade of checks, black's king is forced into a perpetual chase across the board, a testament to white's relentless pursuit in this endgame. Bringing the queen to the forefront is essential to prevent the opposing king from escaping its predicament and to maintain the pressure that forces a decisive result. A desperate attempt to evade the looming checkmate by sacrificing the bishop, exposing the king to a final, unavoidable sequence. The king's exposed position, now directly targeted by the queen's check, demands immediate defensive attention, highlighting a critical vulnerability that could easily lead to mate if not addressed with utmost precision. The king, now exposed to the open diagonal, faces a precarious situation as the white queen prepares to deliver a decisive blow from the c3 square. The monarch's exposed position now forces a swift check, preventing any immediate escape or regrouping. The black king, escaping perpetual checks on the d-file, ventures out towards the center, a bold but necessary journey in this drastically simplified endgame. The king's desperate flight to the queenside opens up a decisive mating net with this forcing check, aiming to trap the black monarch and achieve a swift conclusion. The black king is now exposed to a perilous dance across the board, a consequence of the earlier queen trade that amplified the importance of king safety.